The Canon R5C. This is a camera that has received a lot of criticism since its announcement. So is this camera really as bad as they say, or is it just misunderstood? So let's get right into it. We all know the elephant in the room. Why did Canon remove IBIS? So I think to understand why Canon removed IBIS, we first need to understand what this camera is. This is Canon's first hybrid camera, and with that, there's going to be trade-offs with anything. If you look at hybrid cars, there are trade-offs with hybrid cameras. You're trying to merge cinema and stills into one body, and so you're gonna have to give something up. Let's first talk about the video side of things. And so when we talk about cinema cameras, we never talk about IBIS. So why is that? Why doesn't Canon put it in the C300 Mark III? Why doesn't Sony put it in the FX9? There's room in these bodies for IBIS systems, but they don't put them in because IBIS has some limitations. IBIS was developed for mainly still photography, so it's really good at keeping steady shots steady, but it's not so good at movement. So whenever you do big pans, tilts, typical video movement, IBIS really struggles in this kind of situation. IBIS systems have a very limited range in which they can shift the sensor, and whenever they hit the end of the range, they have to move back to recenter themselves. And this is fine in photography because you don't really notice these fine movements, but in video, it causes jumps and skips in the footage. And so that's why on sets, you'll see gimbals and other stabilizers used, and why cinema cameras don't use in-body image stabilization. And now coming back to photography, you might be saying, well, this is all well and good for video, but IBIS is an important factor in photography. And I agree, image stabilization is important in photography, but not really IBIS. So up until the R5 and R6 was released, Canon's philosophy has always been in-lens stabilization is better than in-body image stabilization. And so if you look at what I'm shooting on right now, this is the RF 15-35. This gives you 5 stops of image stabilization inside of the lens. And if you pair this with an R5 or an R6, you get an additional 2. So however you cut it, the lens is actually doing the heavy lifting as far as stabilizing your image. And this is true for all of Canon's lenses. Hopefully this clears up some misconceptions about IBIS, but honestly, there's so much more on the R5C to like than just whether or not it has IBIS. And one of the things is the dedicated stills and video switch on the top of the camera. I know personally going into any professional project, I know if it's going to be video focused or photo focused well beforehand. And so having a switch that if I'm in video mode for a video project, I get all of the same waveform monitoring, I get false color, I get zebras, peaking, 180-degree shutter, pretty much everything that you've come to expect from a dedicated cinema camera. So you have the same UI, you have the same menu system, and then if you switch to photo mode, which takes about 8 seconds to get from video to photo mode because you're kind of booting out of a camera and booting into a different camera. And then in photo mode, you have all of the same menu systems and everything that you come to expect from like the R5 or R6. So I think for me personally, going into video projects and photo projects and being able to have a camera that is literally 2 cameras in one is actually really cool and something that I think is unique to the R5C and something that I'm pretty pumped about. Another big win for this camera, in my opinion, is the 4K image oversampled from 8K. And I understand that 8K is a buzzword right now and it looks good on paper, but I think more important is having a good 4K image because that's really what sells. If you've ever shot with the Canon C70, it has a beautiful 4K image, a lot of dynamic range, but it tends to be really soft. And if you've ever shot with the R5 in the 4K HQ mode, it's a really sharp, detailed image, but it also causes the camera to overheat. So I think this is a nice middle ground where you have a nice image, but you also don't have to worry about the camera overheating. Another great addition from Canon from the cinema line is MXF. So MXF, if you're unaware of, is a format that all of their cinema cameras can shoot in. It's very edit friendly. You can drop it in Premiere, DaVinci, Final Cut, and just scrub through it, edit. Super simple. It edits a lot nicer than H.265 or H.264 or any of those super compressed formats. So having that professional Kodak in this camera is a big plus. Now let's talk log profiles for a second, because I know this is another controversial one. There's a lot of people online that think that the R5C should have C-Log 2, and I actually kind of agree with Canon on this one. C-Log 3 is plenty for this camera. And I say this because if you look at the C70, it has a dual gain output sensor, the same sensor that's in the C300 Mark III, and that sensor on paper is capable of 16 plus stops of dynamic range. And now if we look at the R5C, it inherits its sensor from the R5, and this sensor is already proven to have between 11.5 to 12 stops of dynamic range. And now if we look at the C-Log charts, C-Log 3 is capable of 14 stops of dynamic range, and C-Log 2 is capable of 16 stops. And so C-Log 2 makes sense for the C70, for the C300 Mark III, for the C500, because those sensors make 16 stops of dynamic range, whereas this sensor only produces 11.5 to 12 stops. And so giving it C-Log 2 isn't going to boost the amount of dynamic range this camera has. And C-Log 2 gets that 16 stops by really raising that floor. And so it has very lifted shadows, and if you lift the shadows of the R5 sensor, I think it's just going to make for a worse image overall. So I kind of agree with Canon on this one. Giving it C-Log 3 is more than enough. It is capable of 14 stops, and this sensor doesn't even do that. So I think C-Log 3 is more than enough for the R5C. And trying to keep this video short and concise, there's so much more on the video side that I could talk about. The inclusion of time code, tally lights, shooting RAW, being able to shoot in different frame rates and different formats and different proxies to different cards. And I think overall this camera is a very capable, fully fledged cinema camera. And then on the photo side, aside from IBIS, you have the same 45 megapixel sensor. You still get 12 frames a second mechanical, 20 frames a second electronic, good battery life, same EVF, same LCD screen. Really, it is Canon's first true hybrid camera, and I think that they really nailed it on this one. It only sacrifices IBIS on the photo side, and like I said earlier, you still have excellent Canon lenses with built-in IS, and so I think this is a more than capable video camera and a more than capable stills camera. I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know, maybe I changed your mind on this camera. Is this style of camera, these hybrid cameras, even something that you're interested in, or would you rather like dedicated cinema and dedicated stills cameras? Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.